Okay, so um, I wanted to now finish just a couple more concepts related to how cultures view the land. And these share a lot of overlap with the idea of placemaking, but they're interesting terms to know. And more important than just terms to know for a term paper or for a test, they're concepts to think with. They're paradigms to help us think better about the complex real world environmental situations that we face. Um, Whether you love the 1980s Karate Kid movie or find it deeply problematic, in the Karate Kid movie, he is told by his karate instructor to like wax a car and like paint a fence and all this stuff. And then he thinks he's not learning karate, but by the end of it, he realizes it was karate all along and it's taught him all these awesome karate moves. I don't know if that actually works for actual karate training. I suspect it only works in Hollywood, but I use that as a metaphor sometimes for why we learn theory in college, theoretical terms like this. It's perhaps not even so much for you to learn the terms, just like it's not so much for Daniel to paint the fence. That's not really the point, although, hey, that's cool that he painted a fence. Um, I guess, the karate instructor doesn't mind a little bit of free labor. But anyways, what Mr. Miyagi's trying to get him to do is to get so good with certain kinds of motion that he does them without even thinking, right? And in the same way, some of these theoretical ideas we're talking about this week, the idea is not so much that you get obsessed with the terms, although you may need to draw on them for a test or something, but instead that as you go later in the course and start to deal with these complex real world situations of land and tourism and things like that, that these kind of ways of thinking, like a placemaking paradigm or a cultural ecology paradigm, that it's become second nature. And whether you think I'm being a cultural ecologist right now, or I'm thinking about placemaking right now, your brain, you're training your neural pathways, you're training your brain to think in those ways about land and about culture. And that hopefully in your life, if you go into fields where you deal with land management or tourism management or applied cultural anthropology, that these kinds of ways of thinking about land and culture are just like ingrained in there. And that in a moment's notice, you can think deeply about things like sense of place, whether or not you choose to call it that to your boss. So that's the overall theory. But without no further ado, I almost said no further Adele. It was very late at night now when I'm lecturing, so I almost said no further Adele, like the British singer. Anyways, with no further ado, let's talk about two final concepts, both of which kind of sort of tie in with placemaking, and in the sense that they both also have to do with how we think about the environment, but approach it from slightly different angles. The first one is social construction approaches to the environment, or to be more simple about it, just social construction of the environment. Social constructionism in general is a body of theory that's very, very influential in the social sciences ever since the 60s, partly because it's a body of theory that works really, really well, and like any good scientific theory, explains a lot of stuff. Social constructionist theory basically says that there is a physical reality in the world, but that we see it and interpret it through a social lens. The theory is actually a little more complicated than that. If you go to like the original studies and stuff that wrote about it, there's this whole kind of process by which we interpret ideas through a cultural lens and then project our ideas outwards and then reify it, or kind of like forget what we've done and like make our projected ideas into our accepted reality. But sort of the long and the short of it is, although there is a physical reality out there, and we're not denying that, that is a physical reality that as human beings, we're always sort of getting filtered through our social lens, through how our culture has trained us to think about these things. There's a great paper from 1994 by Grader and Garkovich called Landscapes, the Social Construction of Nature and the Environment. A bit of a mouthful, but a fantastic paper. And I've talked to one of the co-authors, Lorraine Garkovich, and she's awesome. But anyways, one of the things they say in that paper is every mountain is more than just one mountain. And what they're getting at is there's, not only do people come to understand places in a certain way, placemaking, but different cultures do it very differently because they're all sort of filtering it through their own lens. And in addition to that, she points out something that's kind of interesting on top of that. They say that how we construct a view of a land, what they're calling landscape, how we socially construct our view of a specific land or a specific waterway, that it reflects not just our cultures, which is obvious, but our sense of identity. That very often how we think about a place reflects and affects how we think about ourselves as people. So she shares an example of a Kentucky historic ranch that people fought hard to protect even after that part of Kentucky had by and large moved away from horse raising. People still thought of themselves as Kentuckians and therefore raise horses. So this one historic ranch that a bunch of people got together to try to protect. So we kind of our own sense of self is tied up with our social constructions of a space, right? We don't just treat a mountain as a mountain. We end up shaping it, so to speak, in our own image, connecting it or welding it with our own senses of identity, as you can see in this silly meme about Alaskans and how we respond to federal regulations. Now, social constructions sometimes can be very logical, such as people coming to think of themselves as we are of this place, or people coming to think of themselves as, you know, we are Alaskans and we are hardy people because Alaska is a hardy land and we've had to adapt to a hardy land, right? So sometimes these kind of connections of identity and socially constructed place make a lot of sense. Other times, the nature of a social construction is that it can get constructed in weird ways, right? Ultimately, the idea of something being a construction is that there's a degree of sort of artificiality is too strong of a word, but a degree of sort of arbitrariness to it, right? If it's a social construction, that means you could construct it conceivably in very different kinds of ways, which is part of the value of social constructionist theory. It helps explain why different cultures, for example, can come to very different ideas about race, even when they're looking at the same patterns of human genetic diversity, but coming up with very different terminology for it, and why some cultures don't even have a racial terminology, or at least didn't before globalization. So social constructionists emphasize the fact that, we're dealing with the same bricks here, but we can construct them into very different buildings. For example, you could construct them into a very weird looking building. This is where I went to grad school at University of Buffalo. The Ellicott complex is a bizarre Legoland looking place where you can actually walk on top of the roofs in some areas. It's super weird. It was an amazing place to learn, but the building itself was super weird. But anyways, I have that picture there mainly to remind us that social constructions are inherently arbitrary. They can be constructed in many different directions, sometimes in weird directions. So I wanted to share just two examples that I think are interesting that you might find interesting. Both of which, by the way, sort of indirectly, arguably connect to tourism, at least super tangentially, maybe. So the first one, interesting example of social construction of land or social construction of the environment, is the curious case of Trinidad and Tobago. If you've never spent time in Trinidad and Tobago, it is a very, very, very small nation, as you can tell from this map. It is very small, it is very vulnerable to climate change, to rising sea levels. And as a result, it became part of the group OASIS at the UN, which is basically a group of small island nations that advocate for the fact that, like, hey, climate change is going to engulf our nations in flooding. Let's work on climate change, which makes sense, right? It makes sense if you're a small little nation with a bunch of coastal area like Trinidad to present yourself as such, to socially construct your identity and your land in that way. But the weird thing about that is that Trinidad is one of the nations with the worst CO2 emissions per capita of any country. Terrible emissions per capita, and also a heavily oil producing country. Now, the reasons for that are complex. It's not solely that like the average Trinidadian is just like burning gas for the heck of it or something. It has to do with a lot of complex factors. But nonetheless, the fact remains that Trinidad and Tobago is very tied up with the oil industry and with CO2 emissions. And so, as Hughes points out in a great article called Climate Change in the Victim Slot, it's weird that they socially construct themselves as victims, which they are, so it kind of makes sense as victims of climate change, while also being kind of perpetrators of climate change, right? It's a small nation, so it's not like their effect is very much in the grand scheme of things. But if we were to kind of like divide it per capita, per person, they have a very heavy impact for what size they are. So kind of an interesting example of the odd ways in which we think of ourselves, how we can be both culprits and victims of environmental change, and that we can choose to emphasize one over the other. Another example of sort of odd social constructions of the environment that also shows the weird ways in which we tie our identities to our lands is South African rooibos fields farmers. There's a good article by Ives called Uprooting Indigeneity, but Ives talks about the fact that there's these white rooibos farmers that often employ Black Africans, and actually kind of like two different groups that are different ethnically, but anyways, Black Africans as farm laborers for them, but they're the ones that own the farms. But even though they're the farm owners, they construct these sort of narratives of like, oh, we've been working the land for generations, which is probably more true of their ancestors than them, right? At this point, they have a big staff of people that's helping them out. But back in the days, it was sometimes it might have been one person starting a homestead farm, sure. But over time, right, they developed a bunch of people that were helping them. Nonetheless, they think of themselves as people that have been working the land for generations, right? Which to some degree is true. But then what makes it weird and interesting, these rooibos farmers, these tea farmers, is that because rooibos can only be grown in very specific places, including this part of South Africa, the fact that they've been working it for generation then becomes part of this whole narrative of like, we are tea farmers, we've been here forever. And it almost sounds like they're making claims of sort of indigeneity to the land. But of course, they're not indigenous to the land if we define indigenous the way that we almost always do, which is the people that were there before colonizers. Indeed, they are the descendants of the colonizers. So it's kind of this weird identity game. And I don't think it's even necessarily disingenuous. I think people sincerely think of themselves as sort of products of the land at this point because they've been there for so many generations. But of course, from sort of an anthropological and historic perspective, you would say, well, yeah, but you're not like indigenous to the space. But there's sort of this whole social construction where working the land makes you indigenous to the space if you've been there long enough. So it's a very interesting study. I definitely suggest it to you at some point. An example number 3 of the weird ways in which we socially construct the environment is in situ versus ex situ conservation. If you don't work in wildlife biology, it's highly likely that you've never heard these terms. However, they're terms that I am very familiar with, in large part because I got my first degree in environmental science, and then also as a secondary reason because I worked as a research assistant for Eros Braverman, who's a geographer slash anthropologist slash lawyer who's written a lot about this. But basically, wildlife biologists tend to make a distinction between in situ conservation and ex situ conservation when they're trying to save an endangered species. In situ conservation is we save the endangered species by protecting it in its habitat, in site, in situ. Ex situ conservation is we save the endangered species by oftentimes by doing something outside of its site. Oftentimes that means pulling an animal out of the wild and then establishing a captive breeding population in a zoo, right? If we think that they're so endangered by poachers, for example, we'll sometimes pull in, let's say half of the wild population, there's 20 rhinos left, we bring 10 of them into zoos, set up a breeding program with the hope that we can get enough of a population going to then reintroduce them into the wild. That's a bit of a crude example, but that's the basic idea. But as Braverman points out, although that works in your brain as sort of in situ versus ex situ, it's very dualistic, right? It very much reflects the sort of Western ideas of nature versus humans, right? Nature when it's out doing nature stuff versus when we bring it into the human space, at which point it's not nature anymore, it's out of sight. But not only is it kind of dualistic, but it also is not really a good reflection of how a lot of conservation works nowadays, right? A lot of what we think of as nature preserves, or some of what we think of as nature preserves for like endangered rhinos and things like that, are heavily managed by human beings, right? The last few Sumatran rhinos, we don't want them to get picked off by poachers. So you have scientists that are heavily monitoring them and anti-poaching patrols and all this stuff. Or you have things like the parchelid snails, which we're trying to save, where their habitat in the wild is very compromised at this point, but they take up very small amounts of space. And so we just like raise them in not literally buckets, but basically buckets in the back rooms of zoos, and they're thriving. There's lots of parchelid snails, but they're not in their habitat but in a sense, they're in a habitat, right? They're in a space that's working for them. So sometimes the lines are kind of blurry there between in situ and ex situ. You have um, things like the Moise Bison Range is a great example. I don't think Braverman brings this up in her book, but the Moise Bison Range, which in theory is a place to protect. It's weird to call bison endangered because we have captive herds, but anyways, in terms of in the wild endangered. So it's a place to protect a wild population of bison in the lower 48. But the thing is, the wild kind of has to be put in air quotes because there's kind of like a fence around the whole thing. It's not that huge of an area, and sometimes they give them food. So it starts to sound not exactly like a bison ranch, but a little like a bison ranch. And so sometimes when we're trying to protect animals, we have to do what's effective, which sometimes mean we have to manage the land a little more heavily than we normally would, or it sometimes means making some huge zoo enclosure that starts to feel a little bit like an actual wild habitat, even though of course it's not. And so the lines between in situ and ex situ, nature and society, human spaces and wild spaces, can get kind of blurry, and they will probably just keep getting blurrier, especially as cities get larger and larger and as more and more of the human population relocates to cities. Urban wildlife, right, is going to be more and more a dominant ecosystem for significant portions of the globe, right? And so, you know, pigeons and coyotes and bunny rabbits, oh my, right? The kinds of things that kind of thrive in semi-urban spaces. So sometimes these lines are very blurry, so we construct it a certain way, but the way we construct it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. All right, and the final concept I want to talk about today is traditional ecological knowledge. We will talk more about this later in the semester, so this is just sort of a preview. We sometimes use the word indigenous knowledge for this instead, although I like to use them not interchangeably because they do kind of have two different connotations. Traditional ecological knowledge is exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that any group of people living in an area long enough will develop knowledge, traditions of knowledge that get passed down, right? Long before there's wildlife biologists coming in and studying things with telemetry and test tubes and all that, and radio sensing things and doing population counts, there's people that live on a land and either hunt there for generations or farm there for generations or fish there for generations. And as a result, get to know the animal species really well and the plant species very well and can tell about the population cycles and stuff. In a sense, we're all biologists, right? If we've lived on a piece of land long enough, we've become ecologists. Our culture passes down knowledge about how that ecosystem works. So we call that traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. This became widely recognized in the 70s as a result of several influential studies, one by this guy that worked for the UN, but basically finding out that, yes, wildlife biology is a super helpful field, but in a sense, we also have indigenous groups and traditional groups who have been being wildlife biologists on the land for centuries, if not millennia, who have this whole wealth of knowledge that we also need to tie in, right? We need to not just think that the only way to understand an ecosystem is to do a randomized study doing fish sampling with a radar counter or something like that, but that we can also listen to local people who've been observing this fish for a lot longer than we've had a radar counter. The sonar counters that we use to count salmon on Kenai River are about 60 years old, and compare that to the approximately 1,000 years, if not much longer, that Dena'ina people have been fishing this land. So traditional ecological knowledge. Again, we sometimes distinguish that from indigenous knowledge, and I think one reason why is because knowledge doesn't have to be indigenous to be traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. I have a grandpa, well, I had a grandpa, he passed recently, who farms in upstate New York, was a dairy farmer, small scale family farmer kind of guy, a thing that's increasingly being wiped out in the face of sort of big agribusiness, but he kept it going in his little neck of the woods, and there's a lot of people out in that neck of the woods who do. Anyways, in upstate New York, he farmed this land, as did his father, in the same general area. And I think it probably went back several generations, and we could find a lot of families like that in various rural parts of America where you've had a 3, 4, 5 generations of people farming either the same land or farms very close to each other. Does a group like that have traditional ecological knowledge? 100%, right? Once a group's been around enough generations, and I think 4 or 5 definitely counts, to have observed things over decades, they're going to have a sense of how the land works. So TEK doesn't have to be Indigenous knowledge, but it does so happen that Indigenous groups almost invariably have TEK because they've been living on the land for centuries, if not millennia. Tlingit people are a really good example of that as far as traditional ecological knowledge. So I keep using them as an example because we did that Thornton reading. Some of this is from Steve Langdon's research. I think some of it's actually from Thornton's research as well, but not the book you read, from other stuff that he's written. But Tlingit people traditionally have all sorts of complex knowledge of their ecosystem, which helps them to adapt well to it. So this kind of marries what we were talking about earlier with like cultural ecology with that whole like placemaking, social constructions, all that, right? How we think about the land and know the land and understand the land allows us to adapt to the land, all of which shapes our culture. I could share a few different examples. One of them is gull egg harvesting. So traditionally there's herring gull. If you don't know what a herring gull is, it's a type of seagull. But anyways, traditionally Tlingit people in one certain area of Alaska harvest herring gull eggs. Interesting thing about herring gulls is they lay clutches of 3 eggs in a nest. If you take one, you've got yourself an egg, and the mama gull will just lay another egg. You take 2, mama gull will just lay another egg. You take 3, mama gull will assume there is a serious problem with this area and move to a different space, and suddenly you've lost the nest where you're getting eggs from. So if you want to sustainably use the eggs, you gather fewer than 3 at a time from a gull nest. But if you want to maximize your return on investment, right, how many eggs you're getting per nest so that you don't have to go to 1,000 nests, then you take 2 eggs rather than 1. So it's a straightforward but important strategy for sustainably using the nests. It's good for the gulls and it's good for you in the sense of not causing them to abandon their nests, but you also get as many eggs as you can from the gull while still sustaining them. This is the kind of thing that you could be told from a seagull biology textbook, if such a thing exists. But it is also the sort of thing that long before there were biologists on the scenes, Tlingit people knew because they'd been observing how mama seagulls acted. So that's an example of traditional ecological knowledge. Another example is Julie Cruikshank's great book, When Do Glaciers Speak? And she talks about the fact that Tlingit and other groups in sort of Yukon Territory of Canada and southeastern Alaska have centuries-old knowledge of glaciers and of what the glaciers have been up to, because of course the glaciers have been moving around a lot over the last 1,000 years with a miniature ice age and then more recent warming. Glacier people have centuries-old knowledge embedded in traditional stories of how the glaciers have been moving over time. People also have very good knowledge of different woods in their environment and how that relates to different fish. There's an idea, for example, that yellow cedar has a particular kind of smell that attracts halibut, which might seem a little far-fetched, but of course, if you do any salmon fishing, you know that different kinds of smells can actually be, that attached to your tackle, can actually be very important for attracting fish and therefore landing fish. And so it's very interesting that clearly people were experimenting with different kinds of wood and figuring out what would best attract halibut, as well as what worked well for an anchor for their lines, so Pacific yew, as well as how to use kelp as a form of rope, as well as what kinds of animals to use as bait, specifically herring and octopus, as well as all sorts of things, right? An incredibly well-designed form of technology to get halibut long before sort of modern fishing hooks. Also, interestingly, those fishing hooks tend to be artistic, and that's intended to show respect to the fish, right? I'm not just giving you some crappy hook, but one that's got an artistic imagery to it that I really spent time on. I bring that up to suggest that part of traditional ecological knowledge is stuff that a Western biologist, quote unquote, a Western trained biologist could confirm easily, by which I mean like it would match up well with what laboratory science might tell us. Sometimes it's stuff that scientists didn't realize, but then once they learn it from indigenous communities, they can go back and verify it and be like, oh yeah, that's true. Wow, we've learned something fascinating about this environment. But sometimes it's stuff that doesn't fit in Western science's easy little boxes, such as the idea that a certain kind of image would attract a fish. Western science can't prove that. But on the other hand, can it really disprove it? How would you disprove something like that? Could you do a randomized test of the hooks? Would you want to? And even if you did, what exactly would that prove, since your intentionality is part of what attracts the fish to you? Presumably, maybe the fish would not like that the scientists were trying to trick them as part of a scientific study. So like many supernatural things, or at least things that we sometimes call supernatural, there's not really a way to prove or disprove this. And so a lot of times traditional ecological knowledge sometimes contains things that might make outside scientists kind of uncomfortable because it kind of doesn't fit with how ecology as a sort of Western rooted science is supposed to work. So it's an interesting aspect of TEK. Personally, I find that to be one of the most beautiful things about TEK is that it unsettles our notions of how the environment works. If it's just telling us things that we could have gotten from a sonar study of fish, it only has so much value, but part of what makes TEK beautiful is that it challenges our assumptions. What did I want to get at with this? This is just an example, one of 100 that I could have found. And literally, I just went to Google Scholar one day because I wanted an example. It's from Johnson, Gotsfield, and Hargis. It's from the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in Canada, but it's just an example of the complex taxonomy and nomenclature, which is me fancily saying the many, many names and ways of marking out which animals and plants are related to which animals and plants. We can probably just skip this. Well, yeah, I don't really feel like talking about this right now. If you do get a chance, though, this is a fun, kind of sad, but interesting example of TEK that also kind of blends in with the placemaking stuff. Susan Crate has done research with the Sakai indigenous Siberian horse breeders and looked at how they understand the changing permafrost areas. Of course, with permafrost melting, the areas where they used to run horses are starting to act very weird. The land surface is now rolling and wavy, right? So people's traditional ecological knowledge is the fact that they understand how the land used to be, but now that's being shifted by climate change, which means that their traditional ecological knowledge of good places to run your horses is suddenly not as useful, right? And we see that also with certain things in certain Inupiat communities, right? People's knowledge of the land starts to become less helpful when climate change is changing the land so drastically. But also, it shows us sort of the way in which climate change can affect people's sense of place, right? Suddenly, your sense of place in your TEK is based on what the land's been like for 500, 1,000, 2,000 years before. And suddenly that's clashing with sort of the physical realities of what the land is starting to look like because the permafrost is all melting out. All right, so yeah, you can check out this article on your own time. It's called We All Live on Permafrost, and it is a good one, if a sad one. Trying to TK, like I said before, can sometimes involve things that don't fit easily with science, but which can be incredibly helpful for understanding how a culture relates to a space, and also might just give us a sense more generally as a human species of how to live well on the land. Part of the big value of TEK, if we take it seriously, if we don't just treat it as a box to be checked, which sometimes scientists do, right? Oh, we're going to collaborate with indigenous people and learn about the TEK, but it becomes very formulaic as part of an environmental impact statement, for example. But when it's actually taken seriously, it can really shape how we view the land and maybe to view it in a bit of a more healthy way. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who I mentioned earlier, and who again is going to be talking in Homer in a couple of months, she talks about learning the languages of other groups of people, the language of animacy, the grammar of animacy. She's talking basically about like talking to wildlife and learning from them. As she says that we don't have to do it all alone. We can learn from the other beings in our environment. Now that starts to sound kind of mystical, and that's where you would start to lose some land managers and some sort of Western trained environmental scientists. But also that's a paradigm of thinking that has allowed certain groups of people to live sustainably on the land for a very long time and might be a way of stretching our brain. I think stretching our brain can be a very helpful thing. speaking of stretching our brain, I said that TEK was the last concept, but I'm actually going to introduce one final one. I lied, but it's closely related to TEK. It's kind of just an outgrowth of it. It's a term that I've done quite a lot of research on. It was a big part of my dissertation research and later research, so it's one that I like and that might be useful for you too as you try to understand human land culture connections. It's the idea of hybrid knowledge. Hybrid knowledge is basically the idea that TEK, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, however we want to call it, and then other forms of knowledge, especially sort of what we sometimes call bioscience, or what I've been calling Western influenced biology, right? Sort of the stuff that's associated with empirical testing through things like sonar and telemetry and wildlife population counts. I really shouldn't call it Western influenced because obviously that's spread around the entire world and now been shaped by many countries. But my point is sort of this more technical or laboratory scientific type of ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, they don't stay put and like never touch, right? We treat them sometimes as like opposites, and people will say like, well, TEK is more spiritual, laboratory science is more mechanical, TEK is more holistic, Western science is more atomistic, right? Focusing on the individual things in isolation. Western science sees itself as value-free. TEK is overtly moral, right? It's trying to teach moral things about the land. So we sometimes draw these distinctions between sort of Western ways of thinking of the environment and indigenous ways of thinking of the environment. But of course, those groups of people have not been isolated for hundreds of years and have been interacting with each other. And of course, nowadays, you have native folks who've gotten doctorates in wildlife biology and learned a lot about sort of how settler science views wildlife, but also, of course, also draw on their own culture. And for that matter, settler science is part of their culture, right? That's part of everybody's culture now in the entire world, right? It's influenced how all of us view the environment. Any of us that have been through any form of schooling at all have been influenced by sort of laboratory forms of ecology or bioscientific forms of understanding the environment. So when you think about that, you start to realize that there's not some kind of like primordial indigenous knowledge and primordial Western science that are totally different and don't ever touch, but instead that real people actually understanding their land mix and match all sorts of different knowledge systems to understand the land, sometimes without even realizing they're doing that, sometimes coming up with all new creative ways to think about the land that blend many different forms of knowledge system. I saw this a lot in my own research with Navajo placemaking. People were combining, people in one breath would talk about sort of like the prophecies of medicine people, of what would happen if you desecrated the land. But then in that same breath, they'd also be like, yeah, and did you hear about the study that this has a bunch of endocrine disruptors that it's gonna, cause amphibians to switch genders, or sexes rather. The people were in the same breath using what I was thinking of as like, oh, the scientific ways of speaking about the environment, and then like the TEK ways of speaking about it, or the religious ways of speaking about it. But I asked somebody one time, I said, which of those matters more to you, kind of the environmental side or the cultural side? And he said something that's always stuck with me. He said, well, to me, those are the same thing, right? As an indigenous person, those are the same things, right? Some people may feel a little more comfortable speaking sort of science-ese, he pointed out, but ultimately, right, when I think about the land, I think about all the stuff that I know about the land. So nowadays, it's very much hybrid knowledge for many of us, and perhaps we would do well to learn from hybrid knowledge and not pretend like it doesn't exist. Now, as we talk about all these different things, TEK, placemaking, social constructionism, we sometimes could overdo it. We can think that ideas shape environmental behaviors profoundly and that they're incredibly important. And the reality is it really depends. People's beliefs and ideas about the environment can make them do things like choose to put a mine in place or not put a mine in place, even if it makes economic sense, or to protest a oil pipeline, or to hunt a salmon one way, to fish salmon one way versus another way, right? It can affect our environmental behaviors for sure. It can cause people to preserve places of land that are recognized as holy places, and in a sense, create wildlife refuges long before we had wildlife refuges. And yet, at the same time, ideas aren't everything. People are affected a lot by a lot more than just their ideas, and certainly they're affected a lot more than just by a lot more than just their sort of spiritual understandings of nature or something like that. I use this as one example, just a really simplistic example. It shows political affiliation by correlated to race and faith in the United States. And one of the things that this gets at is it's a kind of complicated graph to make kind of a simple point, which is that people, when we're trying to understand how Americans think about the environment, and if you're someone like me that studies how religious ideas affect environmental behaviors, it's easy sometimes to be like, oh, well, they're a Christian. What do Christians think about X? But of course, somebody is not just a Christian in how they approach climate change. They're also an American, and they're also perhaps a white person, or perhaps a Black person, or perhaps an Asian American person, right? And then you also have things like economic class, right? And you also have things like different forms of Christianity, or you also have people that are belonging to other world religions or indigenous religions or no religion at all, right? There's lots of layers of identity. It's not just one. And so as a result, when we try to understand something like, well, why aren't Americans more willing to use public transport when they know it would be good to help the climate? Well, first of all, in most parts of Alaska, that's not very feasible, but I'm thinking of this because I used to live in a place where it was very feasible, where Denton, Texas, where people really said they cared about the environment, and where most people never ever used the public transport. And it's like, well, why? And an easy kind of knee-jerk response might be like, well, Christianity is not as environmental as indigenous spiritualities. A more complex answer might say, well, we have to add in all the different backgrounds of people to understand why they do or don't take what we would think of as environmentally sustainable actions. Plus, we have to add in the physical realities of their lives. Some people don't have the time to wait for the bus when they're trying to get home to their crying kids, right? Some people don't have the money to invest in LED lights, even if they know that they last longer. And so there are material realities for us as well. So worldview isn't everything. And again, worldviews tend to be from many different things, and people sometimes disagree on what the implication of a worldview is. I certainly saw this in my Navajo research. People pretty much across the board agreed on the sacredness of the mountain that I was studying, but you did occasionally have disagreements about what the implication of that was. Everybody didn't like what the ski resort was doing with the wastewater snow. Most people didn't like the idea of fake snow at all, being used for a ski resort on a sacred mountain. But I did talk to like one or two people who were like, yeah, that would probably be okay if it was pure water, not wastewater. So my point is, people can have the same worldview, but interpret it differently, and therefore lead them to different conclusions about how to act towards the environment or what kinds of policies they do or don't support. In conclusion, land and culture are connected in numerous complicated ways. It is very true where we started this from when Wendell Berry was saying that the land, the country, and ourselves, our communities, create each other, right? Whether we're talking about cultural ecology shaping how we make a living, and therefore whether we live in settled villages or nomadic groups that break apart for half of the year, whether we're talking about political ecology and the ways that our income inequalities drive who's vulnerable or not to environmental problems, and which environmental problems we have to begin with, whether we're talking about the rich meanings we attach to place, whether we're talking about the observations of wildlife that you have over centuries that we call traditional ecological knowledge. All of these are different ways of trying to understand a very complicated picture of how land and culture are intertwined. They all tell us different things. Each of them tell us unique insights, but they do all converge around a common theme that land and culture are closely connected, and that you really cannot think of a culture outside of its land, or arguably you cannot think of land outside of the context of its cultures. Which, by the way, makes travel all the weirder, because if we're so darn attached to our places and have such deep roots with our places as cultural beings, what in the world are we doing when we then voluntarily choose to rip ourselves away from our homelands and go to other places? So more on that later in the course. Thank you very much.